Hello and welcome to episode 12 of On the Cube Leadership Podcast, where we look at everyday events that are happening in pop culture, in politics, in the business world, in ministry, and in the Bible, so that we can take these metaphors to learn how we can become better leaders in our own lives, in our churches, in our ministries, in our communities, in our careers. Wherever God has called you to lead, we hope that these stories encourage you to be a better leader. And as always, we are joined by either one. He is with us now, Dr. Rod St. Hill, the business pastor. How you doing, Dr. Rod?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Craig. And I just love your introduction. It's worth being here just to hear that.
Thank you. So look, let's get into it. So the first one, let's look at something that's happening in the pop world. Well, actually, the theme for today is Aussie, 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 oi, oi, oi. Now we do obviously. Dr. Rod is in Australia. I am obviously Australian. You can tell my accent, but I live in the Dominican Republic, and so. We're very influenced by world news and world politics and things that are happening all over the world. And recently I realized we've been giving a lot of attention to the rest of the world. How about we come back to our roots and think about what's at our core and what's in both of our hearts, which is Australia. We don't get to, expose what's happening into Australia, expose maybe in a good way, maybe also in not a good way. So today we're taking all of our stories from things that are happening in Australia. And so the first one we're going to talk about is the Australian Open. Well, not the Australian Open directly, but there's a story that's just recently come out this week. Now, obviously, by the time this has been released, this is the Australian Open has probably been won by possibly this gentleman. That's it. We're talking about Novak Djokovic, and he came a couple of years ago to do the Australian Open and was expelled. Deported. That's the word for it. Exported. No, whatever. He was deported because of, there was a whole bunch of controversy around COVID and the vaccines and everything like that. And apparently he was deemed to be a threat to Australia because of his public views, because they believe that, this is, a little bit of hearsay. They believed that he was, because he had really strong views about the vaccines, and they thought because of his public figure coming to Australia, we can't permit him to be here. And there's, questions around his vaccination status and all that sort of stuff. But he was deported. And when someone is deported, that means they are banned from the country for 3 years. It's just part of the Australian immigration policy. And so he's been deemed a threat to Australia. But there's an article that was just released saying that maybe he might be let back in. Maybe they might be overturning that because the minister for health, I think it was, or tourism, that actually led the charge on that decision, is no longer in office now. And there's some change of situation, and there's a bit of a change of heart of, now we've moved on from that season of our lives. And we're kind of, maybe some people are realizing that maybe some things weren't correct. And I'm beating around the bush a little bit because obviously I don't want us to get banned or anything like that. And so you got to be very careful with what you say, but he's might be let back in. So Dr. Rod, how do I think from this, there was a couple of things that stood out to me. But first of all, going back on a decision or changing a decision that has been made, how do we do that in leadership when it was something that was such a strong statement?
Look, that's a difficult one. It's easier, of course, if the incumbents in a particular decision-making position have changed. And of course, that is the case in Australia because subsequent to the original case, there's been a change of government. There was a federal election a little earlier in the year. The government's changed, so the minister has changed. And new ministers have, in fact, reversed a number of decisions that were made by ministers in the previous government. So it is easier if the incumbents have changed, and they can argue, for example, that there's fresh information that has led to the decision. They could argue that the decision was wrong in the first place, particularly when it's a discretionary decision on the part of the leader, as was the case here. Sometimes they might be able to argue that they're responding to just a change in the general attitude of their publics, the stakeholders in the organisation, whatever that organisation might be. And the biggest change, of course, that's happened in Australia since he was banned, he was deported earlier in 2022, is that Australia no longer requires people to have had the vaccine for entry purposes or for visa purposes coming into Australia. So their environment is a little bit different, and I think a new minister could also argue that.
So
I struggle a little bit with this.
On that, I just want to jump in for a moment. On that, and we spoke about this a few weeks ago about, you know what, circumstances change. And I think that it takes a good leader to be able to take on new information and make new decisions, not just get stuck in their way for something, but be able to assess situations and make decisions not on old information, but kind of be making decisions on the fly. That I suppose is an advantage as a leader, to not get stuck in your ways, but make decisions and be seeking out new information as well to continually make the best decisions.
Correct. I agree with you on that. And I think that could be argued is the case here, that there's, the whole environment has shifted. The information set is now different. And in fact, I think the public see dissent against the vaccines in a different light than they did even 12 months ago, because of the kind of information that has been leaking out gradually in relation to things like vaccine effectiveness and potential side effects as well.
Yeah. So let's shift our focus to Djokovic now. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But when we're leaders, there's going to be people that are against us. He had strong views about something that he believed. He was a person of influence, which we as leaders are people of influence. God has called us to have strong views about certain things. We've spoken about that in the past, in making sure you stick to your lane, to what strong views you have and the knowledge and experience. But how do we handle that when you're doing what you believe God's called you to? Number one, have a belief about something. But number two, play tennis, right? Like that's what he's called to do. That's his purpose, to play tennis. All what he's doing is coming to a country to play tennis. He's been granted access, his permission, or like visas, all that sort of stuff, everything like that. And then to then have seemingly a whole nation turn against you. How do we handle that when we feel like we're doing what God has called us to, and yet people in more influential positions, official positions, government positions, whatever it may be, make a decision that then turn our life around, literally?
Well, the advice I'd like to give is to stand firm.
Yeah.
But as I've said before in our discussions, it's really easy for an external observer to say that. It's much more difficult when you're in the middle of it and you're the one who's actually experiencing the discomfort, if you like, of the attacks. Look, this is where we've got to apply godly wisdom. We really do need to pray. We need to know for sure, or as certain as we possibly can, that this is the stance that God wants us to take. And then we have to believe that ultimately he will vindicate us.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. It's not easy, but my general advice would be, well, stand firm on what you believe is what God has called you to do, or the attitude you should have, or the public statement you should make. But be continually sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit. And if the Holy Spirit leads you to, say, make a different stance publicly or make a statement, then you just have to trust God and go with it. But no, ultimately, God is the one who vindicates us. We don't have to look to vindicate ourselves. We don't even have to look to others here on earth to vindicate us, but God ultimately will do so.
It's such a good point, Dr. Otto. I have, and like you and I, and we've discussed this on this podcast. We've had challenges with leadership in the past, with experiencing poor leadership or suffering under poor leadership, not the person, the behavior, and it shouldn't be about us trying to get our own back. It shouldn't be. It's about trusting that God will vindicate, because vengeance is mine, declares the Lord. It's not mine to get vengeance, because if we go and get vengeance, then the Lord can't do anything, right? And I couldn't find anything. I did a little bit of research. I must admit, I didn't spend hours researching, but I couldn't find any negative comments from Novak Djokovic. I couldn't, from the situation, everything like that. Like, obviously he responded in news reports and everything when he was interviewed and everything like that. But I didn't see an onslaught from him. Let's go against Australia. Let's boycott this, and let's he seemed to, from what I may be proven wrong, but I wasn't able to come across anything that showed that he handled himself anything less than a gentleman, right? And so
he was very courteous. I think in all of the public statements that he made, and he didn't really make many, but anything he said publicly and anything that he was reported as saying, it exhibited a good deal of courtesy. Yeah, he was very courteous about the whole thing.
That's great. And like us as leaders, we need to learn that is God will vindicate us, but people will judge us by our actions. God will vindicate us, but remember, people are watching how you're going to respond or react to a situation. And I know there's been times in my experience where I've been treated very poorly, and then I have carried myself with integrity. I've still had respect, and I've still honored that person. And people have afterwards, I've gained clients from it. I've gained business opportunities from it, because people turn around and said, I can't believe how you responded, how you reacted after they did that to you. You can still honor and respect them. And so I think it's really important for us as leaders. Remember, you will have people against you, but we need to carry ourselves with integrity. But remember, people are looking at you to see Christ. It's our job to reflect Christ. And if we react poorly in a situation, people are looking at us expecting something different because we claim to be different. And if all they see is the same reaction that they see in other people, then what's different? There's no difference. And so there's no attraction, right? So talking about being attracted to people, Dr. Rod, let's let that a good little transition into our next topic. Let's talk about politics for a moment and our attraction to China. So a number of years ago, there was a China freeze. You can probably tell me a little bit more about, share a little bit more about this, Dr. Rob, but there was a bit of a political, trade freeze, I suppose, to especially considering COVID and all those challenges. Now, in Australia, for the rest of the world, one of Australia's biggest tourism is Asia, right? Australia's tourism runs mainly on visitors and tourists from China and the surrounding regions. And so obviously with COVID, that affected things. We got a lot of visitors from other areas and things like that. We do a lot of deals with China, obviously Australia being close to Asia, there's a lot of deals and trade that goes on in that area. but there was a bit of a freeze that went on. But now the Australian government are noticing, they're feeling the pinch in their back pocket, so to speak, right? And they're now kind of changing some of their strategy, changing some of their trade deals to try to buddy back up to China. Dr. Rod, what's your thoughts on making a stance against something for some key core values, and there was the integrity, like we don't agree with things, so we're going to make a stance, and now going it's not a good business decision, so we'll go and chase the money now, and maybe bend our values a little bit.
Well, you might have heard me sigh there. Again, it's a difficult issue, and international politics is always a big challenge, and national leaders have always got to make decisions about economic interests versus things like human rights interests, our general foreign affairs interests, and so on. And we're never privy to all of the briefings that senior politicians receive. We're never privy to the conversations they have. What we do know as fact is that for the first time in about 6 years, senior Australian political figures, including our Prime Minister, have been able to meet, albeit briefly, with the Chinese president.
Yeah.
And we don't know, of course, everything that was discussed, and it was only a very brief meeting, and you really can't take too much from that, other than it's the first one that's happened for quite some time. I do think there are significant moral issues when we deal with any regime that holds to a worldview that is in some ways diametrically opposed to our own.
Yeah.
One of the significant, perhaps the most significant difference in the worldview held by what we might loosely call Western nations, or nations that hold to a Judeo-Christian ethic, at least to some extent, and countries that are influenced heavily by the Marxist-Leninist approach, is this. In Western thinking, individuals are important and they have value just because they are.
Yeah.
And that value really comes from the Christian notion that we are created and loved by God individually.
Mm-hmm.
So individuals have value, and that has many implications and ramifications in social, economic, and political spheres, not the least of which is what we might loosely call a capitalist economy and a democratic political system.
Mm.
The biggest difference between our way of thinking and the way of thinking of the Marxist-Leninists is that the individual does not really have value in themselves.
Mm.
The value of the individual is only defined or measured in terms of what the individual can do or must do for the state. So the building block, if you like, of worldview thinking under those regimes is actually the party or the collective, not the individual. We start from a very different basic premise. So we find things like suppression of minority ethnic groups to be obnoxious, and we do all we can to avoid that. And in fact, we regret any instances in our histories where that kind of thing has happened. But Marxist-Leninist regimes don't think twice about harassing or even eliminating minority groups or individuals who have a different worldview. And I think that's what makes political leadership really difficult in this sphere, because as soon as we start building an economic relationship, we have to worry about things like basic human rights, the right of the individual to life and to expression and to participation in democratic institutions. So I think it's a very difficult balance. And the other thing too, and I'm speaking really as an economist here, the only way out of poverty really is through business and the wealth creation capacity of business, and then through international trade. And look, we've been able to demonstrate that over and over and over again in history. So it's essentially businesses run by private individuals and some larger businesses in which there are private individuals as shareholders. That's what generates the wealth, which enables the whole of society to be lifted out of poverty.
But on top of that wealth, it's not just the wealth that helps people come out. It's the fact that we're now giving people jobs and giving people purpose, and people are able to aspire and create and all that as well. Sorry,
you're right. But you need to be careful here, because I'm just as likely to go off on a 45-minute tangent talking about what the Bible has to say about economics. But that difference is fundamental.
Yeah.
The role, the understanding of where the individual fits within community is radically different.
Yeah.
In those two ways of thinking. And look, in fact, the Christian way of thinking about the value of individuals is the most radical social innovation in the whole of human history.
So,
and really, sorry, you keep going.
No, like I do want to jump in because I can tell you're about to go on a rant. So let's bring this back to us as leaders, right? There's a couple of things that I kind of want to question. Actually, let's talk the big picture stuff, the nation stuff, right? So us doing trade deal, Australia doing a trade deal with China, if we didn't, and I know that there's a lot of countries blocking them off, semiconductors are now, all that, they're behind, and like all this kind of all that kind of stuff. Blocking them off and isolating them, yes, it will set them behind, but won't that then make them completely independent, and then in 10, 20 years, 30 years or whatever, because they're playing the long game. They don't care. Like they're playing the real long game, especially now the president has now been changed a law that he can now be president forever or something like that. But isn't that more dangerous to cut someone off completely that is reasonably self-sufficient themselves anyway? They're just a little bit behind, and then them come back, versus us having relations with them and then still being able to, I suppose, negotiate and kind of have a relationship, because that's how you influence people.
Yeah. Well, that's Western thinking, though, you see.
Yeah.
And we have to be very careful not to, I guess, interpret their motivations and reactions and so on within the context of our own, broad worldview, which is a Judeo-Christian worldview. And I think a lot of commentators fall into that trap.
Yeah,
and sometimes you'll hear politicians too say, well, we haven't got a relationship, we don't have any influence. I doubt very much that Australia has got much influence whatsoever on either internal or external policies of China.
Yeah.
Frankly, China has needed and may still need to buy some of our exports, primarily coal and iron ore, and also some food products as well, because of their growing population and the growing affluence of at least 1/3 of their population. Not everybody has participated in the great move forward in China. So we've got to be careful that we don't apply, if you like, a Judeo-Christian worldview way of thinking to them. My view is that they will form relationships with us when it suits them.
Mm. Yeah.
And, I think we just need to be aware of that. And the other thing is too, a lot of the media, and I've heard politicians and business leaders and many others say, our disagreements and so on are not with the people, they're with the party. Well, I've been to China quite a few times, and I actually disagree with that way of thinking. I think the truth is that the Communist Party does have a lot of support among the people.
Yeah.
Certainly many I met, and I used to attend a lot of business meetings. I suspect that the Communist Party has a lot of support among the population in general. I know it's not politically correct to say that.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think that is the case. And I base that on my own experience traveling into and out of China for business purposes over a period of about 5 years. So I haven't got extensive experience, but I do have some experience. And I did talk to some Chinese business people, and basically their response was, look, as long as we're making money, we're okay with the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah. So
that was put to me directly. We're okay as long as we're making money.
That's interesting.
Now, not everybody in China makes money. There's still a lot of poor people, particularly in rural areas, and a lot of people have migrated from rural areas into cities where they have very tenuous employment and they eke out a living. Look, I'm sure others who have been to China will know this. I've stayed in a good quality hotel, gone for a walk outside, and you look down the little alleyways between buildings and there are people living in cardboard boxes everywhere.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of poverty there. I do believe that building businesses and engaging in trade will make it possible for many of those poor people to sort of move up through the economic ranks. So I'm a little bit torn. I don't know that we should isolate China altogether, although I do find that many of their policies are abhorrent. And let's face it, down here in Australia, much of our increase in wealth since the turn of the century is actually based on our trade with China.
Yeah.
We rely very heavily on them as an export destination, but also we rely heavily on them as a relatively cheap source of a large range of products, but not only cheap products, but they have become very technically skilled as well.
Yeah.
And very high quality products are now available from China. And in fact, as we're recording this session, we're using some of them.
Yes.
And they are very high quality, reliable and well-priced products.
Yeah. So let's look at ourselves as leaders, maybe ministry leaders or leaders in business or whatever. We're trying to influence, maybe mainly in our ministries. Let's consider ministries. There's someone that is behaving not well, right? Is it best to cut them off completely? Maybe there's someone in our family. Maybe there's someone in our friends group. Maybe there's someone in our business. Maybe there's someone in our ministry, something like that. If there's someone that is behaving not as we agree, what's that balance between completely cutting them off because they're misbehaving versus keeping a relationship open somewhat to see if we can still influence them and try to help them? Maybe they may have addictions or something like that they're caught up in.
Yeah, look, I think this is about discipleship, and as leaders, we do have to involve ourselves as disciplers.
Yeah.
So if we're a Christian and a leader, we really have to engage in discipleship. But the caveat I would add is this: if we believe our business or our position is aligned with God's purpose, then I would counsel that we should not allow anybody's behavior to undermine what you believe and understand to be God's purpose.
Mm.
So that would mean, for example, that if someone is putting other people's lives at risk, I wouldn't tolerate that at all.
Yeah.
I would perhaps seek opportunities to maintain that discipleship relationship, but not in the context of employment.
Yeah.
Now, if it's somebody who's underperforming, you would tackle that through
management,
as it were, the normal channels of things like performance management, which of course that's another form of discipleship if you're a Christian leader. But I don't believe that any Christian leader has a responsibility to maintain anybody's job if they're underperforming.
Yeah.
If they are underperforming in a chronic way, that indicates, well, it would indicate to me that you've got a square peg in a round hole, or vice versa.
Yep.
And that is going to produce stress both for you, for your organization, and probably for that individual. So you need to do the best you can to help them find their purpose or their assignment, which clearly won't be within your organization.
Yes.
Because if it was, they wouldn't be underperforming.
Yeah.
That might cost you in terms of time, and it might cost some money as well. But I think it is important for us to help people make the transition into a position which lines up with their purpose or with their assignment.
Yeah, that's good.
And if it's not in your organization, so be it.
Yeah, that's good. Let's go to another metaphor from this, or like going back to a deal with China, that they don't have the same core values as we do and everything like that. And there's times where we in business might have to make the decision whether to do business with someone that we don't agree, that their values don't align with ours. At what point is it we're doing this deal with China because it's going to bring a lot of money into the country, and, well, doesn't the Bible say that the wicked will store up wealth to hand it over to us? Like at what point do we look at that as a wealth transfer from the wicked to the righteous versus doing a deal with the devil?
Look, again, that's really difficult. And, I'd be very reluctant to sort of point the finger at anybody and say you shouldn't do this or you should do that. It's a nuanced thing. Yes, I agree that business is maybe the most important means by which God does transfer wealth, as it were, from the wicked to the righteous. And we find that statement, of course, in the book of Proverbs.
Yes.
So it's not an ironclad law. That's something to keep in mind. But yeah, business is one of the ways in which wealth is transferred from some people to other people.
Yeah.
And if we're Christians in business, hopefully we're righteous. I think we are, because God defines us that way. And so there will be
operating our businesses in a righteous manner.
Yeah. So there will be some transfer. And look, I think we have to be careful about making bold statements like you should never do a deal in China. I know Christians who operate businesses in China, and they operate those businesses within the business as mission framework. So ultimately, they are focused on transforming individuals and communities.
Yeah.
I know these people to be people of great integrity. They are also taking a significant risk because they're actually running businesses in China. And again, I mean, I have absolutely no trouble accepting that this is what God has them doing, because they're people of great integrity. They pray, and they don't treat this frivolously at all, because it's obviously pretty important, because if they're not careful, they might find themselves in jail in China. So again, as with so many things in leadership, you've got to understand God owns the business, or God owns the organization in which you hold a leadership position. You have a purpose, and you ought to know what your purpose is. And if you don't, as Craig often says, have a look down here, because the information is there.
Yes,
and
free
you
free
can sign
leadership
up
development training
to the
downstairs.
best. Too right. No, I should point like that, not like that, shouldn't I? Anyway. And so that it all really centers around, are you on assignment? Are you fulfilling the purpose for which God has set you apart and specifically equipped you for?
Yeah.
And for some people, I do believe that will involve doing business in China or with Chinese businesses, or indeed with Chinese government instrumentalities. When I was working for a public university, I was in and out of China on a regular basis. I was teaching students. I was, inking deals, all sorts of things in my official role. And, it was a great privilege to be able to share with Chinese students. And I learned a lot about culture. I learned a lot about the way in which their education system works. I came to understand how it is that they have such formidable memories, because they're taught to simply memorize voluminous information. They don't approach learning in the same way that we do here in the West and so on. But I think that was all aligned with my purpose.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be the same for everybody. So look, I know this is not an easy response, Craig. You ask really difficult questions, but I'm sure they're the kinds of questions that a lot of people will have.
Yeah.
And as we so often emphasize, you've got to know what your purpose in God is.
Yeah.
Because that then provides a framework. And part of that too, as Christians, you need to know what your bottom line in terms of values is.
Yeah.
So you need to know when to say no before you have to say no.
Yeah, that's good.
And I've counseled a lot of people in this area. What is your bottom line? You've got to know that before you enter into any negotiations. So you need to know when to say no before you have to say no.
That's really good. I don't think I could sum up that segment any better, Dr. Rod. Thank you. And I think that that's a perfect transition into our next topic. We're talking about business, talking about negotiations, and we're talking about saying no. Our business topic for this week is Medibank, which is a private health fund in Australia, was hacked a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, or whatever it was. And they had a massive cyber attack. A whole bunch of their information was taken. My information was taken. I got an email saying they got all of this information. And I'm like, what do I do about it? Like, kind of a little bit scary, kind of a little bit invasive. It kind of feels like, what? Now luckily I actually have my own measures in place that give me alerts when there's, my information flows in places. So I have certain technology that looks out for that. But Medibank private health fund got hacked. The response to it has been interesting, considering there was the Optus attack, recently, and then there was the Medibank attack. There was a request for, I think it was 15 million, something like that.
About 15 million Australian dollars. It was 10 million US dollars.
10 million US. So now they said no. In negotiations, they said, no, we're standing up for it. Now, Dr. Rod, that must have been a really hard leadership decision to put at risk all of your customers or your followers as a leader, putting everyone's information at risk because you're standing true to your values of not negotiating with terrorists or, whatever that quote is. How do we make a difficult decision like that? Because obviously you become, you open yourself up to other attacks and things like that. Like if you say, there's so much going on there. How do we make that decision?
Well, this is an example, I think, of knowing when to say no before you have to say no. And my understanding is that there really wasn't much deliberation at the board level, that they agreed very quickly that the right response was to refuse to pay the bribe. So they did that very quickly. And I think that's a strength of leadership.
Yeah.
And the other thing they did, and they are continuing to do this on a regular basis, is to apologize profusely.
Yeah.
For what had happened, because actually that's a way of saying we're actually responsible.
Yeah.
That they're saying, this is your data. You trust us to keep the data safe. It has got into the wrong hands. On the one hand, we're not going to pay the bribe because that's just going to encourage these crooks to do it to other businesses or to try it on us again. But we are very, very sorry. Now, the only move they might have made, which wasn't so good, was that there is a case to be made that the executive should have declined to take their bonuses this year.
Yes.
Because they did fail in a major area. They have failed to keep people's private information safe.
Yeah.
And some of the files that have been released have names, file names, which could be taken as an insult by the people whose data is included. So one file name, for example, was psycho. So people who were receiving counselling and psychiatric help and so on, their details were on this particular file. Now, you know what? I can easily understand, the technical boffin saying, what are we going to call this file? We need it to have a short name, something that's easy to remember, and, we can come back to it any time we want. We're not going to forget it. I can understand they chose that, but you can bet your bottom dollar that they wouldn't have been thinking at the time, what happens if the public find out about this? And some people take umbrage. So there's been a bit of a misstep there. That's something you just got to live and learn with things like that. And if I was a senior manager there, I wouldn't be sacking anyone over that, but I'd be having a discussion about, listen, folks, this is an area of risk. We know now it's an area of risk because the information got out. What are we going to do to make sure that we don't inadvertently hurt people's feelings?
So first lesson for our leaders, go back and look at your files on your computer and see what they're labeled as. First lesson. Right?
Yeah, so if you've got a file that says enemies, you better change the name. People I'm praying for or something like that.
Make it, people I'm praying for. That's really good. So I think that's actually, that's a really good lesson is we should act in private as if we are in public. Right, like it's a good principle, right? It's a good, wise principle that to make sure that whatever we're doing in private, remember, whatever we're doing in private isn't in private because there's someone else that's watching anyway, right? So
true enough.
And he's the one that I probably care about his opinions more than anyone. So let's all act in private as if we're being watched by the king, because we are. The other thing, and going back to like the fact their apology, I remember when I first received the email, I read the email and I went, wow, it was I actually felt like it wasn't just this stock standard bulk email that was just sent out, I felt the heart of the CEO that wrote, and throughout it was apologetic. Like, we messed up. We shouldn't have done this. Like we let our guard down. It was really good in the way that they were approaching. And that's a stark contrast. Obviously, we spoke about the Optus one going back a couple of months ago now. I think it was one of our earlier episodes where we spoke about how they were kind of like in denial and blaming other people and kind of ignoring the importance of it. Medibank took the other approach. Now, maybe they had learnt from the Optus one. Maybe they were listening to our podcast. Maybe, who knows? But so the fact that they took ownership, were really apologetic, that was one thing. Being able to say no, obviously knowing where your line in the sand is really important. But I kind of like, yes, we spoke about naming your files as a bit of a joke, but I think this is really important for us as leaders to also be aware of our online security. We need to be very consciously aware that it is very easy that you have your clients' information on your computer. What are you doing to protect it? What are you doing to make sure, like we've just built an app, shameless plug, link in the description below. We've got a free leadership development program where we do collect people's details. I went out of my way in the development of this to pay extra to the security has been over engineered to make sure we protect that information, and done everything that I possibly can. We need to be aware that even there's stuff just on our computer, in Dropbox, in whatever. What are we doing to protect it? Dr. Rod, how do we be wise without becoming, what's the word for it? Becoming scared. I suppose it's not the right word, but do you know what I mean? Like, how do we, like, I'm gonna be wise about this, but I'm not gonna have this crush me and me be worried about this.
Well, if I can take a leaf out of the book of the past, years ago, when all of our records were kept as paper records,
yes,
we used to have rules such as the file must be kept in a locked filing cabinet in a fireproof room or something like that. They're all different variations. So when we had paper records, we had policies, and people were responsible to make sure that the files were locked, the files were stored, say, at the end of each working day in a fireproof room or something like that, or in a safe. And we should carry exactly the same attitudes through to data which is held electronically.
Yeah.
And you must not believe that it will never happen to you.
Yes.
Seriously, because I've been on the board of an organisation that did get hacked. Relatively small organisation, nothing like Medicare or Optus or one of the other government departments and so on that have been hacked. Now, as it turned out, I think the bribe was about $3,000, so it wasn't anything like. You see, these cyber criminals, of course, they scale the bribe to the organisation. So we were relatively small; they just wanted $3,000, and we actually had a guy on staff who was an absolute IT whiz. He said, "Don't pay the bribe, I'll fix it." And he virtually worked around the clock, and within 3 days, he'd restored all the data, and ultimately not a single piece of data ended up being released. So we were really blessed. Wow. But nevertheless, a hacker got in. And I think where we need to make sure we put a fair bit of effort into making sure our data is electronically locked up in a fireproof vault. And too often, the hackers are able to exploit a weakness in security.
Yeah.
So, and I think organisations need to be prepared to buy in external expertise if they need to. Cloud solutions are often more secure than maintaining data on your own local servers as well.
Yep.
But you get good advice on it. If you are in a leadership position, management, or on a board, you need to be asking questions about how secure is the information and what steps are being taken to security. In Australia and many other countries, there are legal requirements in terms of informing the authorities should there be a breach of your data. And the other thing, I think part of our culture needs to be built along the lines that this isn't just data.
Yeah.
We are dealing with people.
Yeah.
And people have feelings, and we need to do everything that we can to protect the feelings of the people with whom we deal.
That's good.
So we should stop thinking of it as data. This is not data. The information we hold, this is about real living people.
Yep.
And people have feelings, and we need to do everything we can to protect their feelings.
And let's be super practical about this. Let's be super practical. Let's just give some good advice, right? Number one is I think you should do some research on cybersecurity and talk to some experts. You, as a leader of the organization, you can't turn around and go, well, I'm not technical. That's not my thing. You need to know, speak to an expert, speak to your IT people, get their advice, but you need to understand it. Now, you don't need to be able to do the code and things like that, but you can't. Ignorance is not an excuse. Ignorance is not an excuse. You have to find the information first of all. Second of all, lock your devices. Do you have a password on your computer that every time you open up your laptop that you have to type in a password? Is it annoying? Yes, it's annoying. But is it safe? Yes. Because if you happen to be at a cafe and walk away and leave your laptop there and someone else can open it up and access all your client's files, you're not really doing anyone a favor. So are you securing that? Your phone, make sure your phone is secure. Another really big one. Please listen to this one. Don't ever use the same password on different websites. Never. I was having this conversation with a client the other day, and they were like, oh, why? Like, it's just, no one will know. Here is how the hackers actually use that. Let's say, you hear people having their Facebook account hacked and Instagram and things like that hacked. And I've known people that have lost all of their contacts and lost their Facebook pages and everything like that because someone's hacked it and then changed it and then started messing everyone as that. How do they do that? They don't hack Facebook. What they do is they go to some random stupid website that you may have happened to join, right? As you're walking, as you're doing something needs to download. It asks you to create an account, and it's just some random little thing, and you like put in your stock standard email and your standard password. They hack those websites which have low security, get your email and password that you've entered into that, and then they have bots that then go and use that same email and password in Facebook, Instagram, all the other places, just automatically. And if you're using the same password in multiple places, that's how they hack. They don't hack your Facebook. They hack someone else. You gave them the username and password for Facebook, and then they got in and then changed the password, and then you can't access your Facebook, right? And so if you use the same, I know, it's just easy. I just have one password and I don't have to remember it. If you do that, you are not secure anywhere online. And what you're doing is, I guarantee you, if you're using the same username and password on one place, it's probably same on your Dropbox or your cloud storage. And so I could find it and I could log on. We actually have a reminder on our site when people create a password. I remind them, don't use the same one as anyone you've put anywhere else, right? So if they can get that username and password to access your cloud storage, they can access all of your clients' data. And so that's your responsibility. Don't ever use the same password. Now, here's a practical solution for remembering your password, right? I use a software called OnPursposeCUBED. That's a number one password.com. I don't get any affiliate fees or anything like that. I think it's something like $3 a month. And what it does is it's a little app that sits on my phone and on my computer. When I go to a site, it automatically recognizes that site has a password for it, and it asks me for my personal password that I use nowhere else, only in that place. I type in my password to unlock my OnePassword, and then it will automatically fill with this random long code of dollar signs and exclamation marks and everything like that, right? So I have 18 long, passwords, so make sure that you're using unique passwords everywhere. Get a software, a password keeper or something that creates a unique password for everything. And make sure you're taking your online security serious. I know that's been a little bit more practical than what we normally talk about leadership, but your job as a leader is to, number one, protect your information, but also protect the information of those people you lead. And so I hope that that's lit a fire under you. I hope that that's inspired you to take action around getting things in order. Well, let's transition to the next topic, next segment, where we look at some ministry leaders. And something really stood out to me when I was doing some research on what's happening in the ministry world in Australia. And I don't know if you're in Australia, and you're in the ministry world, you probably would have heard of an organization called Youth Alive. They've been running for 40 odd years now, and a great organization that run youth events to bring, it's evangelistic youth events. When I was back in Australia running our youth, we were quite connected with Youth Alive, attended a lot of their events, and the leadership there was really impressed with what they were doing. Now, and Dr. Rod, you're actually pretty close with some people in Youth Alive as well. But one thing that really stood out is how they've, an events-based business, right? How they've recovered from COVID, right? Because obviously during COVID, a lot of events-based businesses struggled, closed down, aren't in existence anymore. But how there's an event called Wonderworld, which is in Brisbane, how they're actually creating this amazing event that's attracting youth that is bigger than just a typical worship event, right? It's something bigger that they're attracting people to be able to have an opportunity to then evangelize to people. Dr. Rod, what's your experience with these Youth Alive events?
Well, I'm too old to go to them. Actually, I'm not. Most of us pastors do receive invitations, believe it or not. But my acquaintance with Youth Alive was actually when my own children were going through school, and they went to a number of Youth Alive events, and they absolutely loved them because they're just made for young people, absolutely made for young people. I think this is a really important endeavour within Christendom.
Yep.
Youth Alive isn't the only one. It's probably the highest profile because of the very large crowds that they do attract. There are a few others that operate around Queensland, where I live, and in the other states of Australia. They make a significant point of contact with young people because, sort of to use the cliche, they speak their language.
Yes.
So they get something very different to what they would get, say, in a small church setting, which is what I would provide. I don't have the big lights and the loud music and, the big stage and the big bands. Small churches can't usually do that. But what small churches can do is to support these events and send their young people along to them, maybe even subsidise their young people to these events. I know the leadership in Youth Alive, and they're top notch. They're very good leaders, really outstanding leaders, to be perfectly honest, because it's an organisation that needs a lot of good leadership. For one reason, they rely very heavily on volunteers.
Yes.
And man, you need good leaders.
Yes.
To marshal a large, effective team of volunteers, and they do that.
I always say you have not led unless you've led a team of volunteers.
Absolutely. Well, you know all about that too, of course. The largest team of volunteers I ever had, I think, was 120 when my wife and I were involved in setting up a Christian radio station. And at one stage, we did have 120 people involved as volunteers at various levels and in various areas. One of the interesting things about Youth Alive is I'm not aware that Youth Alive has ever had a lot of charismatic leaders, but yet they've been able to reach out to young people so effectively over such a long period of time. What they've had is good, solid leaders who themselves very strongly adhere to a Bible-based, Christ-focused worldview. So they're very solidly biblically based. And I think that's one of the reasons why they've been such a successful organisation over a long period of time. And they've built up a really good reputation with local authorities, for example, because of the good behaviour of the people who attend and so on. The only thing I would say is this, and this is definitely not a criticism of Youth Alive. If you're a pastor and you're sending your young people along to events like those that Youth Alive put on, don't neglect your role in discipleship.
Don't abdicate. You can delegate it.
Absolutely not.
Don't abdicate it.
You can't outsource it.
Yeah.
That's something that you've got to do within the local church. And as you mentioned, Craig, Youth Alive is largely an events-based organisation. I mean, it's always there in the background, and it is part of a larger denominational structure, but it doesn't disciple young people.
Yes.
Because it's not going to have an ongoing relationship
But that's
with
not
all of the young people who come to their
that's
events.
not their calling. That's not their
No,
purpose.
it's not what that. No, absolutely. That's so. Don't think they're doing it for you. That's my point. We in the church have that responsibility, but I just absolutely applaud what Youth Alive do.
Yeah,
and I think it's a good idea for pastors to be encouraging their young people to go to the events, because they really are very, very high quality events.
Yeah, one thing, a couple of things you said there was one thing that I really love that they do is you've said they speak their language. And it's really easy to do that when you know your calling, you know your purpose, and you have a lane and you stick in your lane, because we're one body in many parts, right? We're all meant to work together. We're all here. We're all called to work together, but we're all here to contribute. And I think that there's no, especially in the church as a whole, we tend to work in isolation or work in silos. And we need to understand that there are organizations that can contribute and help make what we do as a whole better, and not be afraid that, they're going to steal them from us and they're going to take them away, and which I know that a lot of pastors have that feeling. Something else you mentioned was, like, as a pastor, you don't have access to certain resources. And so we do need to, as pastors like yourself, be looking to resources that will engage certain groups. And I'm going to use this as a shameless plug, right? Is about our leadership development program. It's mainly been, although it's open for everyone, it is mainly focused for young adults because it's speaking their language. It's speaking to purpose. It's speaking to the questions they're asking that when they're now entering into adulthood, where they're leaving school and discovering their life and their position in society and community and the church. And so it's being created, and we've developed a mobile app so it speaks directly to them. It's on their phones. It's so easy for them to use. We did it so that we could speak to the young adults. And it's a resource there, not so that we can build our thing, but it's a resource so that you don't have to build that thing. We built it. Let's work together. That's the whole point of this. Like Dr. Roy said, you got to partner with things like Youth Alive. Fine, it's a great resource, but you as a leader can't abdicate that part of your ministry and go, oh, well, Youth Alive does youth stuff. We'll send them there. No, the best way to get advantage of Youth Alive is to use it as an evangelical tool, as a great event that's going to engage your community, but it's your responsibility to then follow up on the discipleship. And it's the same with our leadership program. It's there not for you to forget your young adults, but for you to equip your young adults and engage them, and don't leave them aside. So, look, once again, shameless plug. Link below if you want to check it out and see how it can work for your young adults. But I think it's amazing that if you speak to a lot of people, they would have had some experience with Youth Alive. And I think it all comes down to, for me, the fact that they know what their purpose is. They've stuck to their lane. You've mentioned that they haven't had very charismatic leaders. I think that's a perfect example of people think that, well, I need to be this charismatic person to be able to lead a big organization or to be able to create a movement. No, not at all. You are called to lead whatever you're called to lead. And when you're living your purpose and running your organization to purpose, you can't help but have major impact. Dr. Rod, any last thoughts on Youth Alive?
Well, I think one of the other big lessons that we can learn from Youth Alive is that Christians can have fun.
Yes, that's true.
And as leaders, sometimes we can become so focused on our leadership and so serious about what we're doing for the Lord that we can sometimes forget that, you know, God's okay for us to have fun as well. And, you know, the visuals that we've seen from the, what's it called again? Sorry. Wonderworld.
Wonderworld,
I had to check
yes.
my notes.
Yes.
The vision that was, these are young people having a lot of fun. And, you know, it's okay to have fun. So as leaders, make sure, and I think this applies to people of all ages, as leaders, make sure that your people have a little bit of fun as well as everything
really
else.
Good. That's really good. And we can't forget the human aspect. I think that the connection side of things, right? That's why something like that. Look, Wonderworld. I didn't actually explain it. Is more like a mini festival, like a fair fete kind of thing they set up with rides and, you know, all that sort of stuff. And it's like it's a big it's a mini festival for youth, and I think that with you saying about having fun, that's one challenge that I have. And I think most leaders that are really driven leaders, we can get caught up in this. And I believe that's one of the big lessons I've learned in moving here to the Dominican Republic is here they're very social. There's always something going on. We're always catching up with family and friends, and there's always something. It's very easy for me to just get trapped in my studio, film my content, do my sessions via Zoom, just work in my office. Like, it's very easy to just get caught and stuck on mission. But remember, as leaders, it's our responsibility to influence people. How can we influence people if we don't have relationships with them? How can we influence people if we're not out in the community doing things? And so, yeah, that's a good point, Dr. Rod. Make sure we're having fun. Have fun with your people. Connect with your people. Don't forget to take time out. You know, I had a meeting with one of my team here the other day. Let's go meet in Starbucks. We could have just caught up in the office and gone through everything. I'm like, oh, let's go to Starbucks. Because here Starbucks is kind of a treat for them here. So yeah, it was. Let's remember to have fun. Let's remember to have fun and smile a little bit as well. I sigh greatly because we just said, don't forget to smile and have fun. And now we're about to transition to another topic. Now, although we're doing an Australian theme, unfortunately, I couldn't find a story, when we're looking at biblical leaders and we're doing our series on leadership lessons from Luke. I couldn't find anywhere in Luke where Jesus visited Australia. I couldn't find that. But there was a theme other than the Youth Alive one, which was kind of a nice little, fun way to end that. But there's a common thread amongst all of those Australian stories that we spoke about is there always seems to be someone against you. As a leader, we always seem to be facing opposition. And the story that really stood out to me in Luke was in Luke 22, verse 66 onwards, where Jesus was before Pilate. And I won't read it word for word, but we know the story that Jesus was presented to the people, and they said, "Yep, kill him, his own people." And they were like, "Well, what about the other guy that we want to Barabbas?" They're like, no, let him out, let Barabbas out, and kill Jesus. These are the people that Jesus had been healing, he'd been ministering to, he's been supporting their communities, he's been doing nothing but spread love, and even then they're against him. So much so that they want to kill him. Now, I hope that in your leadership position you don't ever face people wanting to kill you literally, but it can feel like that sometimes in leadership we can feel like the world is against us. Dr. Rod, how do we, while still staying on purpose, like we've spoken about a number of times throughout today, stay on purpose even though people are against us?
Well, it's often the most difficult challenge that one faces in leadership. And I think one of the reasons for that is, as human beings, we need to have a sense that we're loved, and we need to feel competent. And when we have a lot of people criticizing us, that can make us develop this sense, well, they don't really like me very much. I don't feel loved. And maybe worse, well, all of these people mustn't think I'm competent. And so that then raises the question in your own mind as to whether or not you're the right person for the role. And it's really difficult to work through that kind of experience. It certainly helps if you're on purpose, if you know what you're doing is what God has assigned you to.
Yeah.
I had an experience once where I was in a leadership position, and there was a delegation that actually came to my house and said, Rod, we think you should resign. And
wow.
I was very strongly convinced, I hope correctly, that it wasn't time for me to resign. And I resisted it. I said no. And so we went on, and I found it very difficult because I felt, oh, wow, these people don't think I'm doing a good job. And that was very, very tough. But I had felt that God had definitely called me to go on this particular journey with an organization. And so I actually stood my ground. I said, well, no, I'm not going to. Now, they could have forced me out, but they didn't. And it was quite interesting because about 4 months later, God spoke to me and said, now is the time to go. And I've had this experience more than once, actually. And it's pretty tough in that interim period between when maybe you come under a degree of attack and then you feel released by God. And maybe sometimes you're never released, and you have to deal with conflict, criticism over quite a long period of time. Now, the interesting thing was, and I don't say this to embarrass anybody or anything like that, but when I did say I did feel that it was time now that I stepped down, the criticism had all died down and I was asked to stay on. Now, I actually think that's a mark of good yes. leadership. And I think they had recognized by then too, no, this was what God wanted. And, but I did feel that it was time for me to move on. As I say, I mean, I'm still friendly with many of the people involved, even though I'm not living in the same city or anything like that anymore. But it really undermines you. And as we so often do, you keep coming back to the fact that you can sustain a lot if you know you are on purpose.
Yes.
If you know that you're doing the assignment that God has for you at any particular point in time. Yeah. Now, it doesn't give you the right to be arrogant or pig-headed or anything like that, but I think it does give you the strength to be able to say gently but firmly, no, I do believe that I need to stay on in this role despite the criticism. Now, you might be able to learn from that criticism and do some things a little differently.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that as a bit of a side point, off our main point there is, when people come to you, yes, you can stand your ground, but wisdom says, hey, maybe you could address some of that criticism, maybe rather than you just being pig-headed and going, nope, I'm meant to be here. No one's perfect. And we talk about we're on a mission to eradicate poor leadership. A lot of poor leadership, we are displaying ourselves. And so if a group of people come to you addressing a concern, yes, you need to stand your ground, but I think there's wisdom in also going, well, let's discuss this. Let's see if we can find a solution, because maybe there is something that we are doing that we can shift. But back to our main point about being on purpose. I think that obviously you're in that scripture that Jesus knew, he knew what his purpose was. He knew he was meant to be going to the cross. So he endured the attack from people because he knew that that's where he was going. That was his purpose. You mentioned about not being arrogant, but when we know our purpose, when we know what we've been called for, we have a confidence, not an arrogance. And I talk about this balance between ego and humility all the time, and that the arrogance is, I'm awesome because I'm awesome, right? Because I did all this work. Whereas there's confidence, and I think that the godly confidence comes from, I'm awesome because he made me awesome. And I know he called me to this thing, and he's given me the strength. He's given me the gifts. He's given me the ability to be able to get through this challenge, to be able to pursue this purpose. And we can only have that confidence when we truly, truly know what our purpose is. Shameless plug. If you want to discover your purpose, that's the first portion of our leadership program. That's the whole premise of our leadership program, is about discovering your purpose. But going back to this point of, if you're facing opposition, if you know that God has called you to it, that's given, you will have the strength to endure it. Now, I'm not using that verse that people think that I'm saying, because that's about temptation, but if God has called you to it, he's given you the resources, he's given you the ability to do everything. He knew what opposition you would face. Now, doesn't mean we need to do it on our own. It doesn't mean we just suffer in silence because, oh, God's called me to this, so I just have to cop it. No, let's have wisdom and maybe address some of the concerns. Get some support, get some wise people around you, like I have, people like Dr. Rod, and get advice, get support from the people around you so that you can endure, to make sure, because sometimes, here's the thing. I know that there's a lot of great leaders out there that are displaying poor leadership, that their followers or their leadership teams or whatever in ministry approach them and say, hey, this needs to be corrected. And too often that leader with arrogance says, nope, this is my calling, this is my purpose. Because they're not taking the wisdom and taking the advice of the people around them. They're going, hey, I think there's something that needs to be addressed. So we need those people to make sure we are in line with our purpose, because I actually believe, which we talk a lot about poor leadership, I believe that that's one of the main causes, contributing factors to poor leadership, is when a leader is operating just slightly outside of their purpose, because they're overcompensating, they're insecure, they're whatever it may be, and that's what causes poor leadership. Dr. Rod, closing thoughts on that topic.
Well, I guess, hopefully we'll never be put in the same situation that Jesus was. And praise God, he died so that we don't have to go through that same process ourselves. But yes, you're right. He knew his purpose. He knew what his God-given purpose was. And at the end there, of course, the Bible records, doesn't it, that he set his face like flint toward Jerusalem. So nothing was going to deflect him from that purpose. And he endured it for the joy that was set before him. So he was able to endure because he was actually looking forward to the future.
Yes.
And that was what
future
empowered him to endure. I also think it was quite instructive that when Pilate asked him if he was king of the Jews, he simply said, "It is as you say," or words to that effect, depending on the translation. So when he was confronted with the truth, as it were, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And things went from there. Of course, Pilate himself quite clearly didn't believe that Jesus certainly hadn't broken any Roman law, and he wasn't of a mind to condemn Jesus. His weakness, I suppose, was that he himself sought a political solution because he saw it as a political problem.
Yes.
And that's ultimately what ended in the decision to release Barabbas and then have Jesus scourged and then handed back over to the high priest and the chief priests. I've often struggled with the idea that the same crowd that adored him on Palm Sunday wanted him put to death.
Yes.
A week or so later. I'm just not sure now, having read some fairly persuasive theological arguments, that it was the same people.
No.
That in fact it might have been a renter crowd, more or less organised by the chief priests and the high priestly class. It was more likely a renter crowd, and we see subsequently, of course, in Acts, Peter, he says to that high priestly class. I mean, most of the priests weren't involved in this, but it was just that upper echelon. He said, "You crucified Jesus." Now, they didn't do that literally because they didn't, under Roman law, they couldn't.
Yeah.
Literally, the Romans did, but of course, they were the ones who set it all up. And so I don't see Peter as actually accusing, as it were, the ordinary Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that many of them were in the crowd that mourned Jesus as a result of his crucifixion. So one of the lessons we can take as leaders too is that the crowd that's accusing us is not necessarily the whole of the crowd.
Yes.
And at the same time that there might be some loud voices making accusations and trying to undermine us, it could well be that the bulk of the people whom we lead are actually quietly supporting us.
Yeah.
And I've certainly found that in my own experience as well. And then the temptation as a leader we've got to resist is to start criticizing them, say, well, why didn't you support them? Why didn't you stand up and say something? As a leader, don't expect that people will always do that, because for them, the price might be a high price to pay as well.
Yeah.
So we just need to be aware that the voices that are the loudest in criticizing us do not necessarily represent the whole of our stakeholder group, if you like, or our workforce or whatever group we're leading. And I think on balance, when Jesus was in the end condemned to crucifixion, there were probably even the majority of Jews who knew him who didn't want to see him go to the cross. And the ones who did were probably out-of-towners who had actually been bribed by what was essentially the political class. And I think that's just important for us to reflect on as leaders as well.
So, facing opposition, know what your purpose is and stick true to your purpose. Listen to the objections, because maybe there might be some truth to it, and just know that just because there's a loud minority against you, it doesn't mean that you're doing a bad job, doesn't mean you're a bad person, and doesn't mean that everyone thinks that way about you. I'm sure there's plenty of people that love you and support you, as Dr. Rod said, unfortunately, maybe just quietly, but that's okay. We don't put our faith or we don't put our worth in what other people think of us. We put our worth, our importance on the worth that Jesus puts on us. And he put a lot of worth on us because he died for us. He values you a lot, and he's called you to a great, important purpose. So to wrap up today, when people are against you, like Novak Djokovic, make sure that you hold yourself with integrity. Make sure you present yourself well and don't go on the attack. make sure that we use these opportunities to represent Jesus in our actions, not just in our words. In our political space, doing business with someone against us, we need to make sure that we know what we're called to, make sure we go back to our purpose once again, but also make sure we're not just doing something for business reasons. Make sure we know what our core values are. Business. Guys, let's be secure. Let's just, I think that's a big takeaway I want you to take away from today. I want you to go and double check. How secure are you? How secure is your business, your files, your passwords? How protected are you? Make sure you take the time to research that. Youth Alive, once again, back on purpose. When you're chasing your purpose and you are so focused in on your purpose, you will not believe how much more impact you will have. And then obviously talking about Jesus facing his accusers and doing it, knowing his purpose and keeping his eyes set sight on his purpose. So people are against you, purpose. And once again, let me just shameless plug. Want to discover your purpose? Want to improve your leadership? Got young adults that you want to be able to help facilitate their careers, their position in the community, their position as leaders in the church? Link below. Go and check out the free leadership development program we have there. Check out all that information. And guys, if you've got any thoughts, if any of what we discussed has provoked some of your personal leadership, perspective, we'd love to hear your chat, hear your comments below. If you've enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, and please, we'd be honored if you're not yet subscribed. It'd be an honor if you would subscribe to our channel so you can get more content like this, where we take everyday events that are happening in news, in politics, in pop culture, in business, in ministry, and in the Bible, where we can learn to become better leaders. Dr. Rod, as always, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time with us today.
As always, it's a great privilege and a pleasure. I really do enjoy it.
Bless you, and bless you, leaders that are making an impact for the kingdom. Look forward to seeing you next week, and make sure you check out our other podcasts as well. Somewhere subscribe, check out our other podcasts as well. The playlists are there. Bless you. Have a spectacular week.